I'm Dr. Nicholas Carlton, a psychology professor at the University of Regina. You've probably heard of post-traumatic stress disorder, better known as PTSD. You may know that PTSD is a mental disorder which can occur following exposure to specific types of potentially psychologically traumatic events involving a severe threat to oneself or others. But what you might not know is that PTSD wasn't formally recognized as a mental disorder until 1980, when it appeared in the third edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, also known as the DSM. Now, while PTSD was formally recognized just 4 decades ago, we have long documented human exposure to potentially psychologically traumatic events, and the changes that can occur to people as a result. Homer's Iliad from 762 BCE may just be the earliest known documented example of the potential effects of trauma. In this account, the exposure to war dramatically changes the heart of Achilles. One of the earliest documentations of symptoms we would eventually classify as post-traumatic stress disorder appeared in 1667 and was written by Samuel Pepys after the Great Fire of London. In his quote, he wrote, "I did within these 6 days see smoke still remaining of the late fire in the city. And it is strange to think how, to this very date, I cannot sleep a night without great terrors of fire. And this very night I could not sleep till almost 2 in the morning through thoughts of fire." Over the centuries, greater clarity and understanding of mental disorders slowly began to take shape. Perhaps no single event in human history shed more light on the effects of trauma than World War I. The war produced historic numbers of people who, having returned home from combat deployment, reported significant difficulties with anxiety, depression, and substantial neurological disorders. The impact of exposures to potentially psychologically traumatic events could no longer be dismissed. Veterans and the public began to demand that something be done. While the name shell shock, used to describe the symptoms associated with combat trauma, became a term widely used by serving military members, the military leaders of the day took a strong and early stance against recognizing post-traumatic responses. The leaders designated shell shock as being a weakness, cowardice, and a failure of manhood. Only those with physical injuries could claim to be distressed. All others were deemed to be cowards, and in either case, such people were condemned and shamed. By the end of World War I, the health researchers were well aware that the symptoms associated with shell shock were not necessarily related to shelling, physical shock, or physical damage. There was a general acceptance that the responses were psychological and the result of exposure to one or more potentially psychologically traumatic events. By World War II, the term shell shock would be replaced with the term combat stress reaction or combat fatigue. Better understanding of combat stress reaction continued to unfold during the Korean and Vietnam Wars, as did our understanding of and our interactions with mental health and the associated complications. The first fully formalized and broadly accepted recognition of the psychological impact of exposure to one or more potentially psychologically traumatic events began in 1952, when the first DSM included gross stress reaction as a viable diagnosis independent of other diagnoses. Unfortunately, for a variety of complex social and political reasons, the diagnosis was removed before the second edition of the DSM was published in 1968. Finally, in 1980, DSM-3 formally included the diagnosis of PTSD. However, the inclusion required stunning advocacy from grassroots organizations, including psychologists, psychiatrists, veterans, and public supporters of veterans. The tremendous effort required for the PTSD diagnosis illustrates the long-standing biases against notions that exposure to psychological trauma can impact mental health. Over the years, details of the PTSD diagnosis continued to change. Specifically, what kinds of events would be recognized as sufficiently stressful to warrant the diagnosis, as well as various changes to symptom patterns. By 2013, DSM-5 thoroughly clarified the symptom clusters associated with PTSD. The growing research base and social supports appears to have cemented the diagnosis as an official disorder for future DSM editions. We have come a long way since the time of Homer's Iliad, and our understanding of the psychological effects of trauma has improved greatly since World War I. Fortunately, there is now increasing advocacy for awareness, education, and the reduction of mental health stigma. In recent years, we have made great strides in understanding the impact of PTSD. And as public awareness reaches an all-time high, we have shifted our focus from raising awareness to determining the best treatments for PTSD. And perhaps someday we can proactively reduce the impact of psychological trauma. In November 2015, the Canadian government announced a commitment for the Ministry of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness to work with the Ministry of Health, the provinces and the territories to develop a coordinated national action plan on post-traumatic stress disorder, which disproportionately affects public safety personnel. Beginning in 2016, the Ministry of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness and the Ministry of Health undertook several consultations with stakeholders to help inform the development of the National Action Plan. Then, in September of 2016, approximately 9,000 public safety personnel began the Pan-Canadian Pan-Public Safety Prevalence Study. The results from their responses were truly eye-opening. Of the total sample, over 23% of public safety personnel reported symptoms of PTSD. With these stark numbers in hand, the need for action became increasingly clear. The 2018 federal budget reflected the government's commitment to addressing PTSD. On February 8, 2019, funding for 22 research project grants was announced with the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. This launched new research into PTSD among public safety personnel. In addition, the federal government funded a new internet-delivered cognitive behavioral therapy project now known as PSP-Net. The federal government also funded a knowledge exchange hub, the Canadian Institute for Public Safety Research and Treatment, which is housed at the University of Regina. In January 2020, a federal framework on PTSD was completed. The framework will aid in the creation and distribution of standardized educational materials designed to increase national awareness about PTSD and enhance diagnosis, treatment, and management of PTSD symptoms. The framework also includes a glossary of terms for psychological trauma. The glossary was developed through a CIPSRT-led committee of scholars and offers a shared language for everyone working with PTSD. We've come a long way in a short period of time. In only 40 years, a diagnosis for PTSD was produced and evidence-based treatments were designed and tested. Today, we understand the impacts of exposure to potentially psychologically traumatic events better than ever before. We also know that these impacts can vary across individuals and situations. We've seen substantial advances towards improving mental health supports for all people, including public safety personnel. But we still have more work to do. Through continued advocacy, education, and ongoing research, I truly believe we are moving towards a clearer vision of PTSD.